The night the storm rolled through Alabama, the sky looked like it was tearing itself apart. Ethel Mae, a 70-year-old black grandmother, stood behind the counter of her tiny roadside diner, watching lightning slice through the rain. She'd seen storms before, but never one that brought 9 roaring motorcycles to her doorstep. Their leather jackets gleamed with the skull and wings patch that made most folks lock their doors. But Ethel didn't. Instead, she opened hers. What she didn't know that night was that her small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would shake her entire town and rewrite what people thought they knew about brotherhood, loyalty, and race. Ethel Mae Johnson had run Mae's Diner for nearly 40 years, a weathered little place sitting just off Highway 43. It wasn't fancy, just a few red stools, a jukebox that barely played, and the smell of buttermilk biscuits that could pull travelers off the road like a magnet. To her, it wasn't about money. It was about keeping a space where anyone could sit down, eat, and feel human for a while. But in a small Alabama town, anyone was a complicated word. Ethel had lived through the days when whites-only signs weren't just memories, they were warnings. She'd lost her husband to a factory accident years ago, raised 2 children on tips and faith, and had learned to smile even when her presence made people uneasy. On the night of the storm, she was about to close up. The rain came down in sheets, pounding against the tin roof so hard it drowned the sound of the old wall clock ticking. Then came the rumble, low, heavy, and growing louder by the second. When the headlights appeared, 9 motorcycles pulled into the muddy parking lot, their engines growling like beasts in the dark. Most people in town had their opinions about bikers, especially ones wearing Hell's Angels patches. But Ethel didn't flinch. Maybe it was her faith, maybe just age softening fear. But she saw men drenched and cold, not gang members. Without a second thought, she wiped her hands on her apron, unlocked the door, and called out through the storm, "Come on in before you drown out there." They looked surprised. Nobody ever invited them in. Not here. And just like that, a single decision, made out of kindness, would soon echo louder than the thunder outside. The 9 bikers filed in, dripping rainwater onto the checkerboard floor. Their boots thudded heavy, their vests worn like battle flags from 100 roads. Ethel didn't ask questions, just pointed toward the long booth near the window and said, "Sit yourselves down." She poured coffee into chipped mugs, the steam curling between them like a fragile truce. The men watched her move, silent at first. Some looked uneasy, others humbled. It wasn't every day a black woman in the Deep South opened her doors to men most people crossed the street to avoid. But Ethel didn't see the patches. They were just travelers in need of warmth and food. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, she served cornbread and stew. One of the younger bikers, his face rough but eyes kind, finally muttered, "Ma'am, you sure about this? Folks might not like what they see." Ethel just smiled and said softly, "Baby, they ain't the ones hungry." That broke the silence. A few men chuckled, the tension eased, and for a while the diner felt almost peaceful. But not everyone saw kindness the same way. Across town, word spread fast. Someone had spotted the Hell's Angels parked outside Mae's Diner. A few locals, already uneasy about Ethel not knowing her place, called the sheriff. By the time the storm cleared, 2 patrol cars rolled slowly by, their lights slicing through the mist. Ethel didn't flinch when they stopped. She kept pouring coffee. The bikers watched silently as the deputies walked in, boots squeaking against the wet floor. One of them, a man Ethel had known since he was a boy, leaned close and said, "You sure it's safe letting them in here, Miss Johnson?" Her voice stayed calm. "Safe?" she said. "Ain't nothing safer than doing right." The officer didn't reply. He glanced at the bikers, then back at her, muttered something under his breath and left. But outside, whispers had already turned to rumors. By sunrise, townsfolk were saying Ethel was harboring criminals, that her diner had turned into a gang hideout. Business dried up overnight. Customers who once greeted her with a smile now looked the other way. The men had gone by morning, leaving behind a stack of cash under the sugar jar and a note that said, "Thank you, Mama Mae." But kindness in the wrong town had a price. Within days, someone spray-painted trash on her diner's windows. Another night, a brick smashed through the door. Ethel swept it up quietly, humming gospel under her breath. She'd done nothing wrong, but in a town still chained by old prejudice, that didn't matter. What she didn't know was that far beyond that little diner, her story was already traveling. On the backs of 9 motorcycles roaring down the highway, carrying more than gratitude. They carried a promise. 3 days after the storm, Ethel unlocked the door to her diner and found the place almost empty, just the echo of what it used to be. Her regulars had vanished, frightened off by gossip and judgment. Even the mailman had started skipping her stop. But Ethel still showed up every morning, brewing coffee and wiping down tables that no one sat at. The sky was clear that Friday, but the air carried a different kind of electricity, one that came from whispers, from eyes that followed her every move. As she stepped outside to hang the open sign, she heard it again, that low rumble. At first she thought it was thunder, but then it grew louder, steady, synchronized, rolling like a living heartbeat across the highway. When she looked up, her hands froze midair. From the bend in the road, motorcycles appeared one by one, 10, 20, then 50, then more. The sound filled the air until windows rattled and shopkeepers stepped out to see. By the time the engines stopped, nearly 100 bikers stood outside Mae's diner, leather vests glinting in the morning sun, and in the middle of them, the same man who'd sat at her booth 3 nights before, his face now solemn, his voice firm, called out, "Mama Mae fed us when nobody else would. Today, we feed her back." They got to work before she could even speak. Some repainted her vandalized door, others cleaned the lot, while a group formed a line stretching down the road. They'd come from neighboring states, Texas, Tennessee, Mississippi, bikers who'd heard about the woman who showed grace to their brothers. The townsfolk stood at a distance, silent, ashamed, watching the very people they feared rebuild what hate had tried to destroy. Ethel stood on the steps, hand trembling over her heart, tears mixing with the wind. The roar that once frightened her town now sounded like protection, like unity. And for the first time in a long time, the diner felt alive again, not from the smell of biscuits or the clinking of cups, but from the sound of loyalty that knew no color. By sunset, Mae's diner looked like it had been touched by angels themselves, hell's angels to be exact. The broken glass was gone, the graffiti scrubbed clean, the smell of fresh paint lingering in the evening air. Inside, laughter echoed off the walls again, not from fear or mockery this time, but from gratitude. Locals who had once crossed the street to avoid her stood nearby, unsure whether to step forward or stay hidden behind their shame. The sheriff, the same man who'd questioned her days before, parked his car across the street and just watched. For once, he didn't see a black woman helping bikers. He saw a human being who had done what most people were too afraid to do, show kindness without asking for approval. When the bikers finally prepared to leave, Ethel came outside holding a tray of pies, peach, apple, and pecan, her specialties. She handed one to each group, her weathered hands steady. "For the road," she said with a smile. The leader nodded, his voice low but full of feeling. "Mama Mae, you reminded us what family really means." Then he started his engine, and soon the rest followed, one after another, until the sound of their bikes faded into the distance like thunder moving on to bless another town. In the days that followed, everything changed. Photos of the scene spread online, an elderly black woman surrounded by hundreds of bikers standing guard over her diner. Donations poured in. Strangers drove hours just to eat her biscuits and shake her hand. But Ethel didn't care about fame or attention. She just kept doing what she'd always done, serving food, serving love, and proving that goodness is louder than hate. And sometimes in the quiet after closing, She'd look at the old photo of her husband by the register and whisper, "See, baby, the world ain't all bad after all." Because that night in Alabama wasn't about bikers or color. It was about something much greater, how one act of courage can turn strangers into protectors, enemies into brothers, and hate into history.